I'm Roland Main, editor of Moor Intelligence, and I'm joined by Moor experts around the world to debate the issues companies face in going green. There have been many impressive targets on net zero and carbon emissions from governments, big companies, and individuals. But the inconvenient truth is that going green is not easy. So to our panel: David Tomasi of Moor Australia in Perth, Justin Varnon of Armanino in Dallas, Penelope Kasani of Moor Greece in Athens, and Matt Meadows of Moor Kingston Smith in London. So David, you've been speaking to lots of business leaders and senior politicians recently about the move to net zero. How's the debate shaping up?
Thanks, Roland. And I have been speaking to leaders from many walks of life of late. And whilst I have no issue with the objective and goal of net zero, in fact, I'm very fully supportive of it, I do have a bit of a concern around how we're going to get there. Effectively, what's our transition plan? And look, I think many realise it's not going to be an easy journey, and it also will come at a cost, obviously, but maybe most don't realise just how big a journey this is and just how large the cost will be. As a practical example, here in Australia, with our predominance of sunshine, we've had a huge take-up of rooftop solar over the course of the last few years. And whilst it's a great producer of energy, it is now at the stage where it's in danger of overwhelming the grid at certain times of the day. But obviously, without the appropriate battery infrastructure, we can't store the energy for the times when there's either not enough sun or, of course, at night time. So to increase battery storage for these times also means we need to overcome the supply side constraints for battery minerals. And this, of course, has competition from other areas. For instance, the electric vehicle sector, which is also has huge demands in this space. And to improve the supply side means it's imperative we find and develop new mines. And in doing so, we need to make sure that we do this in a sustainable way so we're not undoing all the good work we've done to this point. The lead into COP26 and recent problems with energy security in Europe has also seen a huge debate develop here in Australia over the past several weeks. All of a sudden, coal and LNG are back in vogue, and this is demonstrated to some extent by the surge in prices of these two commodities, as they're still seen as a go-to provider for that base load energy that we all need, not to mention the fact they are cheap and readily available. So how do we move away from this dependence, I hear you ask, Roland? Well, hydrogen has had a lot of airtime lately. But of course, hydrogen comes in all colours of the rainbow, and it is not yet a readily available alternative. So apart from it not being a ready replacement at sufficient scale, it also requires significant investment to even start on the path of being a ready replacement. So does this mean nuclear now gets a look in? So nuclear is definitely a proven technology, has a known cost, which is cheaper than hydrogen, and can be deployed straight away. So, look, I do appreciate this will ultimately depend on appetite, although with the advances in technology, it probably shouldn't be discounted. So in closing, I know I've thrown up what many think are a lot of hurdles, but they are very real ones. And as we know, it's not easy being green. So I would be very interested to hear what others from around the globe are seeing and how it's being addressed in their respective markets, if at all.
David, thanks very much for that reality check. And now, Justin, if I can turn to you in Dallas. Texas obviously is a state built on oil and gas. How is the green agenda shaping up there?
Thank you, Roland. It is certainly not easy being green in Texas. Sure, we have lots of sunshine and wind, which is conducive to alternative energy sources. But as you mentioned, we also have a rich history in oil and gas. Our first major oil strike was in 1901, and we've just been pulling it out of the ground ever since. Texas produces about 4.7 million barrels of oil and 20 million cubic feet of natural gas per day. That's a lot of production. Texas accounts for over 40% of all U.S. oil production and 25% of all U.S. gas production. In Houston, Texas, and the Gulf Coast is home to the largest refining center in the U.S. and home to more than 500 oil and gas companies. There's over 400,000 people in Texas employed in the oil and gas industry, so it's a very large employer. All that oil and gas production has to satisfy more than 24 million registered vehicles in Texas. Texas is also the second largest state in the U.S., so that's a lot of area to cover. And our public transportation system's virtually non-existent. So people in Texas are also fiercely independent, just love to drive. We've got wide open spaces and people just love to drive. Going green certainly comes at a cost. Job protection comes into play. It's about protecting those 400,000 jobs and finding a viable alternative. With that many drivers on the road, it's also about making significant investments in infrastructure. The movement towards electronic vehicles would require an extensive charging station network all across the state and the country at a great cost. While owning a Tesla today may be trendy or great for city driving, you can't make it from Dallas to Houston without pulling over along the way to recharge your vehicle. That's only about a 4-hour drive. So that's certainly not conducive to the Texas mindset. So battery technology would need to greatly improve to make this work. But Texas and the U.S. as a whole are making strides toward being more carbon neutral. The mayor of Houston, Texas, recently stated that the city aims to achieve carbon neutrality by 2050, in line with the Paris Agreement. State of New York passed a law that banned all gas-powered car sales by 2035. Becoming the third state to do so. 2035 is going to be here very quickly. Most experts in the industry don't really see any significant change in the number of gas vehicles being produced until maybe 2026. But many clients and others in the industry are really just focused on R&D efforts in both battery technology and EV motors, just learning more about how they work and how they can improve the technology. Texas has also consistently reduced its dependency on coal year over year to generate our power. We currently are generating over 70% of our electricity from either natural gas, wind, or solar resources. Well, there's a saying that everything's bigger in Texas. That was especially true of a freak winter storm that hit us this past February and put all that rich oil and gas infrastructure and history to the test. This was not the typical winter weather for us in this area, and this slide shows the sheer magnitude of the storm. This slide shows the consecutive number of hours below freezing that our state and our area endured and the low temperature reached. Kind of highlights our three main cities in Texas: Dallas, Houston, and Austin. Dallas area had 140 consecutive hours either at or below freezing temperatures and reached a low of -2 degrees Fahrenheit or -19 degrees Celsius. Slide also compares this storm with one that hit 10 years ago. It was really the only similar benchmark to show how much worse it was this time. The power grid was really decimated and on the verge of a total collapse. There were rolling blackouts to millions of Texans all across the state, and clean water resources were even compromised in some areas. Over 100 people died in Texas due to the storm. We just weren't prepared for a storm like this. Really key challenge was providing enough peak heating loads to both buildings and homes during peak electric loads. There's really competing resources here. 60% of homes in Texas use electric heat, and 40% of homes use natural gas heat. The key issue here was really how can we meet both peak needs simultaneously. So that's really where we failed. Texas really doesn't store its natural gas very well. We store it under the ground. So when we need it, we have to pull it back out of the ground. And, while trying to access the gas when it was desperately needed, all the wellheads and pumps and compressors just completely froze up, and the gas just became inaccessible. Pipelines lost pressurization, became useless, and some power plants started to go offline. But Texas is learning from its mistakes. We're trying to improve our resiliency on the power grid. We've really realized that you only need to protect and insulate a small number of wells, pipelines, equipment, and just overall infrastructure to greatly improve the resiliency on the supply side. Approximately 6% of the wells produce more than 60% of all of our natural gas. So you really only need to protect a small amount. Can you imagine what would have happened to the power grid if everyone had their electric vehicles plugged in at home during the storm? We still have a long way to go. So Texas is taking a lot of steps in the right direction on the move to net zero, but there's still a long road ahead of us.
That's really interesting, Justin. Many people would think that Texas had shut itself off from the debate, but it's interesting that people are really engaging. If I can turn to you now, Matt, in London, the UK government has been burnishing its green credentials with lots of targets and lots of announcements over the last couple of years. Is this all rhetoric, or are we seeing actual progress?
Yes, that's true. The UK has set a number of targets, some of them quite ambitious. The Prime Minister, probably the key target is to become net zero by 2050. It's certainly ambitious. Is it achievable? I think it is. There will be challenges along the way, but I think as the UK and indeed the world have shown, when faced with adversity and a real need to do something, for example, creating vaccines for coronavirus, we can do it and pull together and do it. So I think from the UK perspective, we're not blessed with the sunshine that Australia does. But we do have a lot of wind, and I guess some of the problems you experience with the sun are, only being out half a day. You didn't get it with wind, but there isn't the consistency there. So I think the points that David was making earlier about the infrastructure being in place also holds for the UK. And I think the key element to that is the battery storage to ensure there's consistency of supply, and also potentially some power sharing agreements that we could have in place with Europe using some of the infrastructure, and there would need to be new infrastructure there as well. A point that we hadn't quite appreciated was something that David mentioned earlier around the natural resources required to make the batteries. I think that will certainly be a challenge globally, and hopefully that can be resolved. But as I said earlier, I think if the world put their mind to it, anything could be achieved. We've seen some massive leaps forward in technology. For example, there's the Autobahn in Germany that can wirelessly charge vehicles as they drive along it using similar technology to Wi-Fi charging on Apple phones. So I think that's quite exciting, and hopefully by 2050 the technology will be in a different world. As I say, there are challenges, but when there's a real reason, both environmental and economic reason to affect change, it tends to happen. And I think in the UK over the last few months, we've seen a fuel crisis, caused not by the lack of fuel, but the lack of drivers in the UK. We've also seen soaring gas prices due to supply issues from Russia and other parts of the world. And that's had a real impact on the economy. We've got a client that manufactures toilet tissue, obviously in very high demand at the start of COVID. But they've seen soaring energy prices causing a real problem for their margins and production. So I think a world without the reliance on fossil fuels will also be a good one to create some sustainable and secure power for the economy, so that our UK businesses can operate without the fear of outside influence causing problems with power supply. Now, I was also speaking to a client. It's a fund that invests in wind turbines, and I was talking to them about what things need to change for it really to take off. And actually, there's a lot of things that are good at the moment in the UK in terms of the fiscal incentives. There's some tax incentives to invest in renewable energy, and the government have created an infrastructure there to make it possible. I think the issue that they're seeing at the moment is there's a lack of supply of new wind turbines, certainly onshore. And whilst the finance is there where turbines are complete and they're generating energy, supplying to the grid, people are willing to lend against that, and also there's lots of demand for buying these assets. When you're initially building the turbine, the finance is a little bit harder to come by. So I think UK probably needs to look at that in a little bit more detail. I have another client that produces electric vehicles, predominantly buses actually, and there's big demand in the UK for that at the moment. Certainly local authorities looking to go green, investing in electric vehicles. But again, there are certain bus routes where potentially they're too long, or they're not the charging stations at the right point. Again, it comes down to infrastructure, and I think that's an easy win, because the charging units nowadays, the really big good ones, can charge a vehicle in a matter of minutes rather than hours. So I think that's a real possibility, that there can be an infrastructure, a charging infrastructure, not just a few ad hoc places here and there in car parks, but integrated within the way that we use our vehicles. Not just at home, but people can know that they can go on a long journey and not have to worry about recharging. So all in all, I think I'm very optimistic that the UK can meet the net zero target by 2050. As I said before, there are going to be some challenges, but where there's a will, there's a way, and I believe we can do it.
Thanks for that, Matt. Now, the one big source of carbon emissions we haven't spoken about is the maritime industry. If it were a country, it would be the 6th largest polluter in the world. However, Penelope, I believe things are changing, and shipping lines are seeing the benefits of embracing the green agenda.
Thank you, Roland. The maritime industry is regulated by the IMO, that's the International Maritime Organization. Now, the IMO regulates the maritime industry with regards to its environmental footprint, and among other areas like safety and security. Now, in 2018, the IMO adopted a strategy for the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions, which requires a reduction of the vessel's carbon intensity by 40% by 2030 and by 50% by 2050. To implement this strategy, some of the main measures that are currently on the table are the use of low carbon fuels, market-based mechanisms such as emissions trading systems, and also green financing. However, apart from its, let's say, natural regulator, the maritime industry is under pressure to go greener by other parties too. And this is because maritime is a sector that really brings together all the other sectors of the global economy. It connects the supply and the demand sides of the international trade, either by carrying raw materials to factories or by transporting finished goods to their target markets. And so in order for the entire supply chain to be greener, all of its links need to also go greener. So the maritime sector is under pressure to reduce its environmental footprint by its clients and by suppliers, who also need to adhere to their regulators. There's also pressure from the society, and of course there's pressure from the finance providers, who are also, as you understand, very key players. Currently, 27 of the world's leading banks have come together to commit to the Poseidon Principles, these lenders jointly represent around 185 billion of US dollars in shipping finance. So what they've done is that they have promised to effectively incorporate environmental considerations in their lending decisions towards the maritime industry. So to summarize my main points, yes, becoming green is a challenge for the maritime. On the other hand, though, not being green, or rather postponing those steps towards that direction, is really not an option if they want to stay in the market, which is moving towards that direction. Now is the time for the maritime companies to start working on how they can incorporate environmental considerations into their overall strategy and how they can communicate their progress to their stakeholders. Now, there's a lot of noise about what standards should be used, how KPIs should be measured, and what assurance can be provided on those disclosures. But really, in my opinion, the main point here is for the companies to really be honest about where they are now in terms of their environmental footprint and commit to a feasible plan that it's also aligned to their overall strategy. And it is really a journey. It won't happen overnight. Transparency and also effective communication with all stakeholders are essential for the companies to keep their competitiveness and remain in the market. There is a lot of information in the public domain. ESG reporting and sustainability reporting have been added. And so these companies are under the spotlight constantly. And so any inconsistency, any exaggeration, any observation really that conflicts what is disclosed in those reports will have a knock-on effect on their credibility and their reputation. And everybody knows that reputation is everything if a company wishes to remain competitive. So I guess there are two main points. The global economy is really interlinked, and maritime glues every link of the chain together. So inevitably, maritime will have to go greener under the pressure of the supply and demand forces of the global economy. Secondly, there is real tangible benefit for the maritime sector in embracing environmental considerations in their strategy and by being transparent about it. Over to you, Roland.
Thanks very much, Penelope. That's very encouraging indeed. So there we have it. It's not easy going green, but Mura's experts can help with practical solutions that will make a real difference. So get in touch. And if you'd like to hear more about the big issue of ESG, tune into our next session.